Welcome to the Leading with Purpose podcast, where we share practical advice for purpose-driven work and board leadership and mission-focused organisations. I'm your host, Jill Holtz from Diligent, and in this 4-part series, I talk to different leaders to explore regulations and compliance for non-profit boards, what's coming in 2026, why oversight matters and how to prepare. We'll cover critical areas of regulation, but also how charity and non-profit boards need to think about managing their oversight and compliance and policy. I hope you enjoy the series. My guest today is Dale Waterman, a solution designer and regulatory expert at Diligent, with deep experience in translating evolving mandates into practical governance requirements for organisations. Dale explains how the changing risk universe is driving non-profit regulatory shifts and why operational resilience is essential to sustain programmes while meeting expectations from regulators, donors and beneficiaries. We explore how and where boards should prioritise effort from training requirements to AI governance guardrails that stand up to scrutiny. Listen now as we talk about board oversight habits that work, how to align policies with programme realities, and the minimum controls every non-profit should adopt. Stick around to the end for Dale's great advice on how to strengthen resilience and compliance in 2026. We've been looking at all the regulations and legislation that non-profit boards and charities, foundations, etc. have to comply with. And we have a new guide coming out on this for non-profit organisations. So I really thought you were ideal to invite to talk to me a bit about this topic and to get your perspective. So welcome, Dale.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. Looking forward to the conversation.
Great. So I want to kick off with a question. How is the evolving risk universe, if we can call it that, impacting the regulatory landscape as we come out of 2025 and into 2026 and beyond? How's that impacting regulations?
So I think it's a great question, and I think what's quite useful for us is to sort of take a step back, just for a second, and look at what we might call sort of the big picture from a regulatory perspective. And I think we could probably all agree that we unfortunately live in a world that's increasingly sort of divisive. There's more polarization and fragmentation, and we've got some decades-long international relationships that are being rapidly reshaped around the world. And from a regulatory perspective, I think if we look back at risks that we've tried to address in the last sort of 20 to 30 years, I hope it's probably true to say that most of those risks that we've addressed fairly successfully have been done through collective efforts. And probably one of the things we should be a little concerned about, and it's actually pointed out by the World Economic Forum in their global risk report, which is definitely worth having a look at. And this was for 2025, so we've got a bit of hindsight now as we reach the end of the year. But what they've predicted was that we would see, unfortunately, sort of new lows in terms of global cooperation across different things like geopolitics and humanitarian issues, economics, environmental, societal, technology. And I think, we could probably agree that that's definitely a trend that we've seen over the past sort of 10 months. And the challenge for us from a regulatory perspective, to try and bring it back to how this impacts our landscape, is we've got countries that are turning inward, and they're focused on internal economic or societal concerns. But it does mean that arguably sort of our age of globalization and this use of sort of multilateral efforts to tackle some of our big risks and problems in the world is maybe coming to an end. And the impact that has on our regs is that when you're not working collectively on problems, you tend to lack harmonization. So what the collective action did from a global perspective is it drove at least a good ambition around harmonization. And when you're an entity that's trying to deal with laws and you're multinational and you're operating across borders, it obviously helps enormously when you start seeing things that you're familiar with, and there's that harmonization. And so, looking forward at the world, unfortunately, the outlook's probably quite pessimistic, certainly from a World Economic Forum perspective. And you only have to look at some sort of policy approaches or regulatory approaches to some issues like, for example, the environment or climate change. It's pretty clear that the countries are approaching these issues very, very differently. And another one is AI. I think it's a great example where you've got a divergence in the way that countries are looking to govern AI in future. You've got those that are much more on the sort of principled human rights, AI safety side of the equation. And those tend to be sort of hard laws. The EU would be a great example of that, with plans around enforcement. And then you've got countries that have decided to go a different route. On the opposite side of the spectrum, you've got someone who's thinking more about what they would position as innovation, but sort of
Yeah,
anti-regulation.
innovation. Yeah.
Yeah, and they're more focused on voluntary guidelines and things like that. And so these different changes will impact the way in which organizations will see these new laws arrive across the world. And a great example for me is GDPR, which isn't that long ago. If you think about GDPR, 2016, I think it went live in 2018, set up by Europe, was seen as sort of this global high water mark. And then you had all these GDPR inspired or GDPR like laws that developed across the world. And, whether you're in the Middle East or Africa, in the UK, LATAM, APAC, there was a lot of familiarity with that. And when something like the AI Act came out, which is only 2024 August, really, really only this year from sort of some of the deadlines, but we thought, I think, that we would see sort of a GDPR-like effect where that would again be the high water mark. There's been a lot of effort put into the AI Act, and we'd see something spread across the world, and we haven't. We've actually seen a lot of divergence in approaches, and I think that's a great example of some of the geopolitical, competitive, themes that we're starting to see.
So what I'm really hearing from you, just to recap, I suppose at this point, is that because of changes and geopolitical things going on, and that regulation is diverging, and it depends. So if you're operating in more than one locale, you have to be aware of that divergence. You have to understand that what is
Correct.
in one place is
And
potentially
it's
radically
difficult.
different in another place.
Because not
Yeah.
only have you got lots of laws developing, because everyone has these laws, whether it's AI or cybersecurity or operational resilience, but now they've all got little tweaks that are different, and that makes it more complex to implement.
Yeah.
Um,
So
from a
complex, a
risk
lot
that,
of complexity.
yeah, yeah. And from a sort of risk perspective, I think something to call out for folks, again, sort of looking at the big picture side of things, is I saw a Gartner report or study, I think it was not too long ago. And when they're looking at the risks that we're having, um, and this was for the GRC audience, what they found was that over 75% of GRC professionals feel like there are more risks today than there were 2 years ago. And again, over 70% of them felt that the time to impact of those risks was reducing quite quickly. So we had quite a significant finding. And what that means is, as we're thinking about this macro economic geopolitical kind of environment, but as a risk team or as an organization or as a boardroom who's responsible, people are feeling way less comfortable and confident that they're actually identifying all these risks. And secondly, that they're prioritizing the right ones and deciding which ones should monitor, which ones they should manage. And what was quite an eye opener for me actually in that WEF study was that when we looked at what we thought would be the key risks this year, so for 2025, and it's a big study, it's 900 people, a global study of subject matter experts, also from different roles and regions. And what they found was that the top one was to do around conflict. So you had sort of state-based armed conflict and geo-economic risk. Makes complete sense to us as we sit here in October. But when you look ahead 2 years, the key number one risk that they identified as subject matter experts is actually misinformation and disinformation, which is different for us when we know about the democratic impact, democracy and things, but we hadn't actually thought about the impact that disinformation will have on the way countries are perceived, and therefore, their ability to trade and tourism. So that's going to be a big one. And then polarization's coming. And then when you look even further ahead out to about 10 years, what surprised me is the top 4 risks that have been identified are all environmental. It's like extreme weather, changing, weather patterns, a lack of resources. And so it's becoming difficult to be comfortable about what risks you should be addressing. And that obviously impacts the regulatory landscape, because we know that things are happening like cybersecurity and cyber espionage and AI governance. So we're all maybe not happy about the fact that we're having enhanced laws or new laws, but we understand why we need them. But that doesn't mean that organizations aren't feeling completely overwhelmed, because there's like this tsunami of new regulations coming in response to all these new risks that are slowly being identified.
I think that's a really great summary and really interesting about the misinformation one. I mean, we're not surprised by the environmental ones, and we know misinformation, disinformation is there. But even to think about that in terms of, misinformation about your own organization and what's out there and what's being communicated is a risk. How do you see then the role of a non-profit board, if we can take that, because that's what I'm talking to you about today? How do they need to adapt in response to that tsunami that you described, not just a current wave of regulatory transformation, but a tsunami?
Yeah.
What do they need to think about doing to adapt to that change?
Um, I mean, it's quite it's quite a difficult question in some senses, but I think we know that corporate boards are more focused on shareholder value, and we know that our
Yeah.
non-profits are more sort of mission driven, and
Yes.
they're thinking about the community impact. But I think that many of the challenges that we're facing today, which revolve around sort of things like digital transformation and cybersecurity and data privacy, AI adoption, those actually cross over between them. And so I think we can learn quite a bit from what's probably happened in the corporate space, because they are more mature, they've been driven more by regulation. So we've got a lot that I think we can learn there. What I thought would be useful to share is maybe thinking about some of the trends that we've seen amongst these laws. So it's not all of them, and I don't profess to be an expert of all sort of MDO nonprofit laws, but there's some interesting trends that we're seeing in areas like AI governance and cybersecurity, operational
Mhm.
resilience, and I think those trends will shape the way that boards begin to adapt to this new world. So the first one that I would highlight is that a lot of these laws are risk-based. So, historically, probably, particularly in the US, you had more rules-based legislation, which meant, these are the things you had to do. There was quite compliance orientated. I wouldn't call it tick the box, but there's clarity on the 10 things you had to do. Risk-based legislation is quite different, because it means that you need to identify the risks, which is the conversation we've just been talking about, and then you need to assess what those risks are and what these laws ask you to do. The AI Act, the NIS2 directive, which is cyber resilience in the EU, DORA, which is for banks around operational resistance. All these laws ask you to implement what the kind of language they use is things like you need to have appropriate and proportionate technical measures or organizational measures, or you're meant to look at your organization and implement measures in accordance with your size or your profile or your risk or the complexity of your services or your offerings. Now, that sounds quite tricky. The nice thing is, it's not a one size fits all. You can treat industries differently. And it actually means you have to assess. That is why I think that talk about the different evolving risks is so important. You have to identify that risk and then think about how that risk impacts you with your mission,
Mhm.
your organization, your objectives. And then you have the right to choose sort of whether to go for silver or platinum or gold, or what controls to implement. But the regulatory change that will impact boards is you need to demonstrate how you made that decision. So there's a lot more documentation around how did we make that diligent and thoughtful decision, and then how do we demonstrate that we implemented those controls in accordance, with our risk-based decision making. And that's going to be a big change, and I think it's a trend that we'll continue to see across regulations.
Just to recap that, you've talked about changing away from a compliance mindset to more of a risk mindset, assessment of those risks. How are they going to impact your organization? How are they going to impact your organization's resilience? And then what do we need to put in place to mitigate that? And also document all that decision making so that you can show from a
A
regulatory point
regulator.
of view,
Mm.
yeah, that you have considered these risks and you've put these things in place. And provided you do that, at least you've met what some of those legislations and regulations are now asking you to do.
Correct. But it's
Okay.
it's quite a big change in the way in which, because it's not that one size fits all,
Yeah.
which has pros and cons, but in
Which is
my
good.
opinion,
It has its merits.
it's
Yeah.
yes, yeah. The second one that I think is super important for boardrooms is this sort of trend around sort of governance and accountability. So looking at it particularly from a management body perspective, quite a lot of the laws. I mean, if you think about it historically, you always have a fiduciary responsibility and you have
Hmm.
oversight, and that's what boards do. But I think what's changed now is they're actually making it a legal obligation. So if you
Okay.
take acts like sort of some of the operational resilience laws, and we're seeing them everywhere across the world, but NIS2 would be a cyber version, and as I mentioned earlier, DORA would be for financial entities, and those are European based. But what they all ask you to do is they ask the management body to actually take responsibility for some of the decision making. So if it's a cyber resilience, for example, you need to understand what is a cyber risk as a board member, because you're now accountable. So that's different from someone presenting to you what their cyber plan is and telling you what cool things they're going to do and what controls, and then assuring you that everything's okay. You now have a duty to, one, understand what the risks are. You have a duty to actually approve the measures that will be implemented. Remember, they have to be appropriate and
Yeah.
proportionate. And then you have a role of actually ensuring that they're implemented from a control perspective. So, I
Okay.
think what board members are going to have is a lot more skin in the game.
Yeah.
And, in certain instances with some of these laws, and it varies across Europe, but you will start seeing elements of personal liability where you can be demoted from your role, or you can lose your responsibility, maybe temporarily, maybe permanently, and there can actually be personal, civil, and in the extreme cases, criminal liability we're starting to see, which is really new. Um, it's not something that I want to sound too scary, because it's generally for people who have been deceitful or extremely
Yeah.
negligent. But that's a trend around sort of the accountability of boards, let's say, which means you've got to learn a lot more about. So no different from corporate governance, if you think about to the days back to Sarbanes-Oxley, where as a CFO you're signing financial statements, and you're on the hook for making sure that they're accurate and that you're being transparent.
So it's really important then that board members realize that there's been a shift away from turning up at the board meeting, approving kind of listening to a presentation, going, yeah, yeah, that all sounds good. That they now it's incumbent on them to make sure that is getting implemented, because they could be held personally liable, and there's a lot of risks with that. Again, I do think, to paraphrase our CEO, Brian Stafford, he says now that, governance is an exercise in risk management, and it really is, isn't it? That you as a governing body have to be on top of those risks, but it can have an even personal impact as you on that from that liability beyond a sort of a duty of care, as you said, or fiduciary duty.
Yeah.
Um, Dale, you mentioned, you've been talking a lot about operational resilience. So obviously, that's going to really resonate with nonprofits at the moment. They've had a lot of change in terms of their
Mm.
funding, where their money's coming from. I mean, obviously, operational resilience is beyond the cash and the donations or the revenue, but that's obviously a kind of global theme that you're seeing across the new regulations. How is this concept of organizational resilience evolving? obviously is important, but why is it important? And what can boards do ultimately to try and build that organizational resilience in this kind of constant change of
Yeah.
regulations?
It's a pet love of mine in some ways. And I think that if it wasn't for all the talk about AI, which I completely understand, I think this would probably be almost a global number one trend for probably 2024, 25, 26. But I guess what's important is how the notion or the concept of operational resilience is evolving a little. I think originally when you spoke about operational resilience, we would think about a crisis happens, how quickly can you respond to that and
Mhm.
get back to where you
Bounce
were? So
back,
it's
as it
like
were.
that's
Yeah.
exactly. So it was that like that idea of how quickly can we recover, and that
Mhm.
was really what we thought about from a crisis perspective. Whereas the sort of I don't know if it's more modern, but I guess the sort of updated version of this is not just about how you deal with a crisis, but how, in a sense, almost how you can turn it to your advantage and what that
Okay.
opportunity can be. And so it's not just sort of the negative, but the positive in a sense. And, there's the famous Churchill quote about never letting a good crisis go to waste. And it's something
Yeah.
along those lines. Um, and I saw a Boston Consulting Group study a little while ago, which was super interesting. And what it talked about is it looked at top performing companies and and what made them top performing. And resilience was a key common denominator. And what it found was that when you're a top performer, um, and the world's going well, like everyone kind of performs okay. So you sort of move in parallel, everyone's doing okay. But where you start seeing the difference between top and bottom, or like where you separate maybe the wheat from the chaff, is how you operate during a crisis. And that's when you
Okay.
really differentiate yourselves. And so the idea is to, and in fact, what the BCG study found was that 30% of long-term shareholder value came through how you dealt with a crisis and crisis periods. And of course, we're not talking about shareholders here, but that's still it's about value, like, the value
Stakeholder
that you offer
value.
your community. Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Will come through how you manage periods of crisis, which makes actually complete sense from an MDO perspective. And so um, the trend that we're sort of seeing is how you can the benefit, I guess, of operational resilience, and the way that they talk about it are the different advantages that you would have as a organization. One, if you're anticipating an issue, uh, i.e., you've looked at all the risks we've talked about and
Uh-huh.
you've identified which ones to prioritize.
Uh-huh.
When the shock happens, the impact, the crisis, the impact on you as an organization is less because you've anticipated coming and you've kind of
Mhm.
cushioned that effect. You've thought about maybe it's
You've
supply chain.
planned.
Exactly. You've got alternative plans. So your
Mhm.
initial impacts, firstly, is lower, which is good. Secondly, your speed to recovery is way quicker because, again, you've anticipated what's coming and you're able to adapt to the new circumstances more quickly than your peers. So that becomes a competitive advantage, or an advantage to your constituents that you're supporting. And then thirdly, and it's probably the point I was trying to make at the start, your recovery extent is greater. So in other words, when you come back, you actually start to thrive in those new circumstances, which is really interesting. And that's when you start getting that competitive advantage. And in a sense, this is where winners stay winners or winners become losers. And what they also found, this is also an opportunity for people who maybe weren't at the top table through their resilience, through some period of crisis, they
To
become
rise above
winners.
that. Yeah.
Exactly. And so you can leapfrog because of your strong operational resilience program.
So I was thinking when you were talking about all of that very, very simple tool that's used, in many organizations over and over again, but your SWOT table, your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And even a simple framework like that can start to make you think about, what are the threats and doing that risk assessment that you talked about earlier. So once you know what your key risks are, you're maybe using things like scenario planning as well. How are we going to
Yeah.
deal with if this thing happens? What is the impact going to be? What is our kind of plan of action? Means that if it does come to pass, you are in a better position, as you said, and you have that resilience and you have that bounce back then. But also looking at the opportunities of risk. So for example, we're in higher education as a nonprofit. Student demographics are changing. That's a risk because our traditional revenue came from this type of student. But what does that mean in terms of opportunities as well? Maybe there's a new cohort of student that we've never served traditionally that we can now because of changes.
Yeah.
And that could be an opportunity. And how do we plan for that? So I'm hearing understanding, assessing, planning are key things to build that resilience.
Yeah, the sort of lingo that they use in the risk space is that you have the black swan, which is the unpredictable event. It's really rare. But then they talk about grey rhinos. And the grey rhino is
Yeah.
something where there's signals that come, and we might choose to ignore them. And we even do this in our personal lives. It's kind of human
Yeah.
nature. I don't want to go for that checkup. I know
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
should go for the checkup, but I don't. And it's something similar where how do you identify these grey rhinos in your industry or in the community that you serve, and then think about how you could prepare for them. And uh, I think one of the things we haven't probably answered with enough detail is what can boards kind of do in this space.
Hmm.
And the key change that I think's happened is that previously we saw operational resilience, or we could call it organizational resilience or financial resilience, but we saw these as sort of risk team things. And I
Hmm.
think what boardrooms can do is they can embed that into your corporate strategy. So our corporate strategy is to become operationally resilient, and these are the benefits we can achieve, and that could be driven through a boardroom. Of course, boardrooms fulfill an operational resilience perspective. I mean, their role is governance and leadership. And so they can
Yeah.
play a role here in making sure there's good governance, because you have good governance, you'll deal well with a crisis because you've prepared adequately.
Yeah.
You've talked a little bit about those dress rehearsals for a bad day, and leaning in like that. I also think that one of one of the key takeaways should be we've all got to, and I'm from a certain vintage myself, but we've got to build a sort of a continuous learning mentality.
Yeah.
So what board members had to know, and what they need to know today and in future is changing. And so
It's changing. Yeah.
developing that learning culture where you're continue learning, I think, super important. And then finally, communication. I I don't want to think about, we talked a little bit about, for example, accountability of boards. I don't actually want that to be a negative. I mean,
Mm.
it'll drive behavior, but I actually think there's an opportunity there. So that what the boardroom needs to do is learn more about these issues rather than just having oversight. Actually understand how the risk process happens, why the controls are being implemented, and then they can learn how to ask the right questions
Asking the
and
right
be
questions. Yeah.
informed. And
Being informed.
it should be almost like a safe space where, whether you're in a senior leadership team or whether you're a GRC professional, you're not offended by these questions. This is a boardroom who comes with a different perspective to yours and can ask questions that should be helpful in helping make, the organization more resilient. And then
Yeah.
probably the other one takeaway is what the GRC pros and the leadership team would want to hear is that you're going to make those decisions more quickly. So, the idea of good communication and agility is super important. And we have less excuses today than maybe in the past. We don't need to get together for boardrooms. We can meet remotely. We've got amazing technology that can give us the latest signals, near term information to help us make informed decisions. Um, sift through huge amounts of information and give us summaries so that we can be informed and useful in those conversations. And I think that's something that that board members should embrace.
So, as we wrap up, Dale, I'm going to ask you one final question. I'm going to ask you to pin your colours to a mast. What one piece of advice would you give board chairs, governance professionals about future proofing their organisations against regulatory uncertainty?
I think the one thing that we possibly haven't mentioned, so you want to identify the right risks, and then you want to prioritize the right risks that will have an impact on your your goals and ambitions, and then you will implement a lot of what we've talked about. But I think one thing that we need to do more, and you can drive this good behavior as a boardroom member, is we need more of those simulations. So it's no
Yes.
longer just about the compliance tick box and saying, yes, I've got the policies, here's my folder, our outside counsel have produced it, it looks good, I can share it with a regulator. It's like to actually reduce and mitigate those risks and prepare for that bad day and make sure that you manage it as well as you can. You need to practice. And so I think that's where a boardroom can make sure there are simulations, and in a positive way, make sure that the controls that we essentially, our vision around our policies is actually being brought to life through operationalization of that program. And you do that by making sure and learning through those simulations. And that would be a key takeaway and a great learning opportunity for the boardroom too.
I love that, Dale. I think that's excellent advice when it comes to the whole area of organizational resilience that you've talked so much today. So I want to thank you very much for coming to talk to me today. I know you have a very busy schedule, so I really appreciate you taking the time to
My
share
pleasure.
the benefit of your wisdom and experience. Thank you, Dale.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning into Leading with Purpose today. I really hope you found today's discussion useful, interesting and insightful. This series supports our non-profit 2026 Regulations Outlook, a concise guide to the mandates and trends shaping the year ahead with practical steps boards can act on now. To learn more and download the guide and other resources, go to www.BoardEffect.com Leading with Purpose. That's www.boardeffect.com/leading with purpose, and we'll put that in the show notes. For more boardroom intelligence, check out our sister Diligent podcast, the Corporate Director Podcast, the voice of modern governance, where directors and experts regularly share practical insights on governance, strategy, risk, and digital transformation. Finally, I wanted to ask you a big favour. If you enjoyed this episode, then I'd really appreciate it if you would please take a moment to rate and review our podcast. It helps other people find it. And please do share this episode with any colleagues who are planning 2026 agendas, regulation, compliance and training. I look forward to bringing you more practical advice for purpose-driven work next time.